With the help of many colleagues, I started the series in 2020 as a forum for cross-generational and transnational conversation about the possibilities and challenges of engaging with art as a vehicle for social justice. Since then, we've heard from an amazing range of artists, activists, and scholars from around the world. You can see the whole list and find links to the recordings of some of the sessions on the Art and Protest website. I'll put the link in the chat here in just a minute. While both creativity and courage are always required, many of those we've spoken with over the past 2 years face real and present danger, sometimes on a daily basis. Just last week, a lot of us were simply blown away by the courage and resilience of Sarah Karimi and the other Afghan women filmmakers we heard about. Today, with the outbreak of war in Eastern Europe, I particularly want to remember our friends and colleagues in Ukraine, Belarus, and also in Russia, who are now facing peril on a whole new level. The energy and optimism that gave impetus and life to art protest during the waves of global protest in 2019, 2020 seem distant right now, at least to me, though not to all of us. Just this morning, I had a marvelous conversation with a creative young artist and publisher in Brazil, where there's a truly remarkable spirit of engagement, resilience, defiance, and joy in a country that is also facing crisis and repression on many levels. Such conversations are vital now more than ever, as the world heads towards a future that seems darker, more perilous and uncertain, where the direction forward is not as clear as most of us would like. We'll hear more about the challenges of art and protest in an age of crisis and reaction in an upcoming session with Kim Charnley and Greg Cholette later in March. But for now, I just wanted to acknowledge, again, the seriousness of the present moment and to remember those who are in need of our solidarity today. All of us who can need to stand up and be counted in this struggle. Now on to today's session, which I think will be one that give us all hope, as well as frank recognition of the challenges we need to overcome. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for today, Laura Raicovich, who will be talking about a problem near and dear to my own heart as a curator and someone who's trying to navigate the difficult relationship of a particular cultural institution, the Beinecke Library at Yale, to structures of power and privilege that often seem anathema to the cause of activist art and protest. If the big question behind the series is, what can art do that other forms of protest can't? Then the topic of today's session, at least to my mind, is what can institutions do about that? A writer and curator, Laura Raicovich, has a lot of experience dealing with that question on a practical day-to-day level, from her work with Creative Times Global Initiatives to her most recent stint as interim director of the Leslie Lohman Museum of Art, an institution dedicated to queer art and artists, and perhaps most crucially for her current trajectory, her time as president and director of Queen's Museum, which she led through difficult times following the election of Donald Trump in 2016. As she herself puts it, Laura is dedicated to art and artistic production that relies on complexity, poetics, and care to create a more engaged and equitable civic realm. Today, she will be talking about her latest book, Culture Strike, Art and Museums in an Age of Protest, which recounts many of her practical struggles to achieve that goal within the context of existing cultural heritage institutions. Before turning things over to Laura, I would like to invite everyone please to submit questions into the Q&A queue, not the chat, so that we can get to those in the conversation after her talk. And now, take it away, Laura.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am delighted to be here with you all. Thank you so much, Kevin, for the invitation, and to the Beinecke for hosting me. This has been an incredibly rough week, I think. I've heard from many friends and colleagues that things aren't going so great. So I just want to acknowledge that this is a really tough time, and thank all of you for showing up and tuning in, and just to acknowledge that this is, really a rough moment. So before I jump right in, I'm just going to also acknowledge the fact that I am talking to you from Lenape land, the traditional and current unceded Lenape lands of Manhattan. And acknowledge the Lenape stewards of this lands, past, present, and future, and my gratitude for having the privilege of living and living my life and raising my family in this territory. I also wanted to just give a little access check. I want to describe myself for people with low vision. I am a white woman with shoulder length brown hair with some yellow stripes in it. I'm wearing big glasses and some red lipstick and a sweater that has blue and green patterns on it. It's a black sweater with blue and green patterns on it. And I'm sitting in a sort of slightly dark room with some bookshelves and other stuff, furniture visible in the background. So that being said, I want to talk about my book, Culture Strike, and what I thought I would do. It's actually yellow, but it doesn't look very yellow on this, on the screen, or my screen anyway. What I thought I would do is read you the introduction of my book, just as a jumping off point, and tell you a little bit about both what inspired me to write this book, and also what I learned from that process. The book was actually envisioned, following my departure from the Queen's Museum, which I'll talk about in my reading. And I really was trying to make sense of the many experiences I've had throughout my career in the cultural universe, primarily in New York, but also working internationally. It's interesting because one of the things that really became very clear to me was that I had to explore the evolution of cultural spaces in the United States, which is what I do in the book, and also look very specifically at some of case studies from recent controversies. So let me begin by reading to you for a little bit, and then I'll walk you through some of the kind of bigger confusions. Maybe they're confusions, but they're also conclusions that I drew in writing the book. So I'll begin. We're living in an age of protest. Around the globe, radical movements from prison and debt abolition to Extinction Rebellion climate activism have penetrated mainstream discourse. Culture and art necessarily have also come under fire. While art has enormous potential to shift society, the institutions upon which it relies help hold systems of power in place. As much as I love museums and have dedicated my career to them, they are repositories of cultural hegemony, mirrors of society's ills, from enormous wealth gaps and other legacies of colonialism to the exclusion of historically marginalized groups. Museums and cultural spaces are part of the systems that protests hope to undo. I believe this undoing and redoing can not only make museums better for more people, but also map ways to make change in society at large. This is why I wrote this book. My most recent experiences at the time of the writing as the director of the Queen's Museum was by turns exhilarating, challenging to my core, and heartbreaking. And those experiences are central to my thinking. I led the museum for 3 extraordinary years through moments that proved to be high points of my professional life and others that threatened to thwart my deeply held convictions of art and culture's vital engagement in societal change. A public museum, the Queen's Museum is situated within a public park in one of the most ethnically and culturally diverse geographies on the planet. In a city of immigrants, Queens, host to New York City's 2 airports, is the place most newcomers arrive. Many stay in the string of neighborhoods along the number 7 train, the borough's spine, which transports a population that speaks over 138 different languages and dialects. Each subway stop opens doors into different cultures, and yet we're all New Yorkers. In awe of these realities, I took up my post at the Queen's Museum in January 2015. Just 18 months later, the election of Donald Trump would dramatically shift the landscape in which I worked. While the museum While the museum remains on an upward trajectory of increased attention, support, and visibility, the results of the election deeply impacted the staff and our publics and collaborators surrounding the museum. Over a decade before I arrived at the Queen's Museum, community organizers had been hired in a brilliant move to connect with nearby immigrant communities. Led initially by Jay Shri Abichandani and then Prerna Reddy, this organizing effort created a model for how museums could engage with their publics. The goal was not just to bring people to the museum, but rather to leverage the museum's resources to surface and enact desires of these communities via cultural organizing. In the aftermath of the election on November 8th, 2016, the Trump administration's policies and rhetoric unleashed a Pandora's box of hate, and one of the primary targets was immigrants. At this museum, these new conditions were no mere abstraction. It was an all too harsh reality. 5% of the Queen's Museum staff received deferred action for childhood arrivals or DACA protections, President Obama's executive order that provided legal status to many people brought to the United States without documents as children. This group heard Donald Trump's promises to repeal DACA, without which they would risk losing temporary relief from legal uncertainty or even face deportation to countries they had never visited. Further, in the weeks following the election, many of the people with whom the museum staff had collaborated for more than a decade and a half through its free family programs, New Yorkers art classes taught in over a dozen languages, gatherings and classes at Immigrant Movement International in Corona, Queens, and other long-term partnerships. These people now feared leaving their homes and even sending their children to school. Whether or not the participants in these programs possessed documentation, there was worry of being caught up in a raid or being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I started getting Facebook alerts from various local groups spreading news of immigration and customs enforcement, or ICE, being at one or another subway stop or heading to a particular neighborhood. Some even claimed that the alerts themselves were fake, sent out on social media to stir further anxiety and fear. City council members planned special sessions to reassure their constituents, and New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio convened a town hall in Corona with then council member Julissa Ferreras Copeland, along with a cadre of city agency heads and local uniformed police, to reassure immigrants that we were all New Yorkers, no matter immigration status, and that local police forces and the educational system should be seen as allies. In this climate at the museum, we started holding weekly all-staff meetings. We contacted immigrant rights groups to be sure to stay updated on any changes in policy, whether local or federal, and shared this information with our networks. We coordinated with city agencies to be sure our staff and publics could access important information about their rights. We assembled a list of the museum's resources that could be lent to local groups, and we decided to join the art strike called for Inauguration Day. On January 20th, 2017, while the Queen's Museum was closed to regular operations, the staff created a program that invited the public to work with a printmaking collective on creating posters, buttons, and other ephemera for the coming protests. Over 300 people gathered in the atrium that day. I was deeply moved by this gathering of retired school teachers, artists, students, local moms, and grandmas. Throughout the day, several in attendance thanked us for creating a space to gather on a day they felt so vulnerable. On that rainy day, it never would have crossed my mind that just over a year later, I would resign my post. What happened over the following 12 months would prove immensely complex. Several trustees, rather a handful of them, did not like the fact that we were joining the Inauguration Day strike. Their position was that we should continue to do the work we had always done, but do it quietly. At least one trustee expressed fear of retribution from Trump via punitive tax audits of board members. From my perspective, not only had the political environment created a predicament in managing a staff with a significant number of increasingly precarious immigrants, but I also felt strongly that we needed to be forthright and direct in our support for communities with whom we had built a great deal over the year. Trust was at issue. The staff and I drafted a statement of values, which we felt would be an important buttress for our work. This took the form of a letter from the director that we posted to the museum's website. I presented the values statement at the next board meeting, which were unanimously approved. The statement, since removed, included the following. The Queen's Museum asserts, excuse me, the Queen's Museum asserts a deep commitment to freedom of expression and intentionally supports and celebrates difference and multiplicity as fundamental to our collective liberation. We believe that art can shift the ways in which we experience our world, and therefore artists, and cultural institutions have a powerful role to play in society. Therefore, the Queen's Museum advocates for art as a tool of positive social change, critical thinking, discussion and debate, discovery and imagination, and to make visible multiple histories and realities. The Queen's Museum supports, initiates projects and programs that are inspired by actively listening to the needs and aspirations of the communities we serve and consider to be our valued partners. The Queen's Museum works to engender respect for a diversity of cultures, broaden access to art and ideas, and connect the public to opportunities for civic agency. And the Queen's Museum uses our resources, human, financial, environmental, and beyond, to create greater equity, inclusiveness, and sustainability, both within our institution and in the broader society. Outside the Queen's Museum, artists, art workers, curators, professors, and others started organizing with, as one Google Group's name made clear, a sense of emergency. Around this time, New York's Museum of Modern Art installed an exhibition of art from their collection by artists who would no longer be welcome to the United States due to the Trump administration's so-called Muslim ban. The Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum submitted amicus briefs to the Supreme Court to overturn the ban, which were co-signed by the Association of Art Museum Directors, the American Association of Museums, and more than 100 museums all over the United States. Smaller organizations were doing whatever they could. From the sense of emergency cohort, a new working group formed, calling ourselves Art Space Sanctuary. The group was headed by Abu Farman, an artist and professor of anthropology at the New School, as well as a dedicated immigration rights activist. We look to the sanctuary movement of the 1980s in Latin America, largely carried out by clergy members committed to liberation theology and using churches to shelter people fleeing violence, and the new sanctuary movement of the 2000s, spearheaded by an interfaith group of leaders in the United States seeking justice for immigrants and migrants. We thought that Art Space Sanctuary could communicate that cultural spaces were, in fact, for everyone, and that within these spaces, there could be ways of conveying care and support. The Queen's Museum had a long history of collaboration with frontline organizations, including the immigrant advocacy group Make the Road, the addiction support group Drogaditos Anónimos, as well as others. The idea was to create a series of protocols that would allow museums and cultural spaces to make connections between vulnerable populations and these types of frontline organizations. I strongly believe that the Queen's Museum would be an ideal organization to embrace this concept, given our long-term relationships and the extant programming at the museum. We hoped to gather a critical mass of cultural organizations that would become art space sanctuaries by agreeing to guidelines Farman had developed and made public on a website. This, we hoped, would signal the cultural sector's support for vulnerable people who worked within museums as well as visited. The guidelines were flexible, and given that the Queen's Museum already had relationships with many frontline groups, it made sense for us to sign on. Buoyed by the enthusiastic support of a few trustees, I presented it at our next board meeting. The response was profoundly disappointing. A handful of board members thought the idea was completely untenable, expressing fears that the notion of cultural sanctuary would turn the museum into a place for people to hide out or sleep, a fundamental misunderstanding of the concept. With outspoken opposition to the initiative, it was impossible to move it forward. Moreover, the rhetoric of the rejection was grounded in the notion that as a public institution, we should not, and indeed could not, take sides in the political debate surrounding immigration. We had to repudiate a pro-immigrant initiative like Art Space Sanctuary in order to maintain a supposedly neutral position. It was demoralizing. The situation was further complicated in June 2017 when the Mission of Israel to the United Nations contacted the museum about renting the galleries to hold an anniversary event for the historic vote that paved the way for the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. The Queen's Museum's physical building was an appealing location for the event because it was where the UN General Assembly met from 1946 to 1950, prior to the museum's existence. The proposal was to reenact the vote that took place on November 27, 1947. Then President Mike Pence was to be the keynote speaker, addressing hundreds of invited guests. I felt deeply uncomfortable with this space rental proposal. Typically, rentals at the museum were for weddings, bar mitzvahs, and other types of celebrations. This was clearly a very different kind of event. Not only was I gravely concerned about the operational impacts of an event of this scale, as well as its security implications, the mission's confirmation of the Vice President of the United States attendance more than 4 months out was strongly suggested the political nature of the proposed event. With its government sponsorship and roster of politicians speaking and attending, I believe this was an event engineered to support the views of particular government aims, and that this violated what had been a longstanding practice, and at the time, I believed a policy of not renting the space for so-called political events, meaning events that that were related to actual politics and sponsored by politicians. Recognizing the unique character of this proposed rental, the matter was escalated to the board for consideration. I recommended against holding the event, but the decision was ultimately up to the trustees. After much debate, the board decided to decline the Mission of Israel's proposed event. 2 days later, an article appeared in the Jerusalem Post stating that I was anti-Israel because I had edited a book about cultural resistance that contained a section about BDS, the movement inspired by Palestinian civil society's call to boycott, divest from, and sanction Israel. The article was highly critical of me for my supposed canceling of the event. A New York City Council member called for my dismissal and started seeking support for a petition, and the New York Post piled on with additional criticism. The Queens Museum board then reacted with great speed, reinstating the event it had days earlier rejected. No public statement corrected the misperception that the initial decision was mine. I found myself under an avalanche of hate for alleged anti-Semitism. In the aftermath of these articles, I felt I had to prove to board members, never mind the online universe that was now propelling vitriol at me at a staggering speed, that I was indeed not an anti-Semite. My Jewish husband counseled me to talk publicly about his family's history, to relay that his grandparents were Auschwitz survivors, that our son had had a bris, and that my grandmother had helped Jewish men escape across the border of fascist Italy during the Second World War. It felt horrible to trot out these facts about my existence and the effort to convince people who had known me for years that I did not hate people for their cultural or religious backgrounds. Meanwhile, the work at the Queens Museum was garnering broader acknowledgement by the public. It was particularly encouraging when the New York Times profiled my work at the museum. We had just opened a series of successful exhibitions, among them Never Built New York, which featured an array of architectural projects planned but never realized that made unique use of the panorama, one of the centerpieces of the museum's collections, and a 10,000 square foot, which is the panorama is a 10,000 square foot model of every building in New York City's 5 boroughs that was created for the 1964 World's Fair. I was also deep into the planning of a major exhibition of artist Mel Chin's work, which I would co-curate with Manon Sloan and the nonprofit arts organization No Longer Empty. This exhibition was planned to fill the entire museum with major public projects that would fill into public sites throughout New York City. Additionally, we had recently received significant grants from prestigious foundations. With these promising fundraising results, we had achieved a financial milestone toward which I'd been working since my first days at the museum. There was a lot to be proud of for everyone associated with the institution. Nonetheless, as fall unfurled and the Mission of Israel's event took place at the museum, the politics of the event became clearer. At the November 28th event, Pence delivered his speech as planned, which went far beyond a celebration of Israel's anniversary. It turned out to be a 45-minute policy speech previewing the Trump administration's intent to move the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Trump made his public announcement of the move from the White House just a week later. And then the days that followed, protests led to violence in Jerusalem and criticism from many US allies and the United Nations. Against precedent, the Queens Museum's building had been used as a backdrop for an announcement of a major shift in US foreign policy. As fall stretched into winter, I could tell that a small group of board members were unhappy with my leadership. particularly around my recommendations that we participate in the Arts-Based Sanctuary Initiative and decline the mission of Israel's proposed event. The job of the director of a museum director is difficult enough without this kind of doubt from a board. And after a grueling year end, I decided in late January 2018 to resign. It really broke my heart to come to this conclusion because I knew I had so much more to contribute to the museum and to its publics. There were a few board members who did not like that I was determined that the museum should take a position on events that deeply impacted our staff and surrounding communities via our operations. I believed that as a cultural space reflecting our collective values, that we could not remain neutral, especially as the very foundations of democracy seem to be crumbling around us. Neutrality, in fact, is not at all neutral. Rather, to paraphrase the South African anti-apartheid leader Desmond Tutu, it is a position in and of itself that supports the status quo. And given how the museum had always operated, as well as its commitments to its own staff and collaborators, we knew the realities that confronted us could not be met with indifference. Since my departure from the Queen's Museum, I've been contemplating the history of how museums came to be in the United States and how they operate today, particularly in the ways their modes of storytelling embody specific politics and how we might understand their connection to a whole matrix of power relations and ideologies. Amid calls for diversity, equity, and inclusion in our spaces of culture, there is no way around a confrontation with neutrality as a persistent ideology within the museum. In a sense, it is the expertise of the museum that makes it trustworthy, that it selects art and makes exhibitions that are educational, that instruct its publics. However, there are many structures, from operations and governance to curatorial choices and the treatment of staff, that undergird these selections, and the ways in which they are presented and interpreted by the museum that are directly oppositional to any desire for diversity and inclusion. The problem lies in the fact that these structures are often unseen and unregistered, and that they undeniably privilege those of specific race, class, educational, and social backgrounds. If we truly want to undo barriers to inclusion, we must face at this false neutrality and dismantle it. Further, the problem with neutrality as a claim for a museum is that it fundamentally neutralizes any criticism, dissent, or alternate history that it might present, which contradicts its very claims to education and free and open exchange of ideas, as we will see enacted in the forthcoming chapters. Neutrality, in effect, results in the disenfranchisement of artists or publics that may engage in debate within its walls because the institution's very power structures, historically and operationally, nullify concepts of civics to maintain this neutral position. This manifestation of neutrality requires that both sides of any debate are equally strong or must be equally represented. This simply doesn't measure up in reality. According to the American Alliance of Museums, museums are considered the most trustworthy source of information in America, rated higher than local papers, nonprofit researchers, the US government, or academic researchers. But they are also places of profound alienation. Their typically grand architectures have served many purposes beyond the simple task of containing and ensuring the safety of artworks. These include signaling the importance of art and culture in a society, the colonial might of a nation, the generosity and largesse of major art patrons, and perhaps most tellingly, the tastes of the patrons who founded the institutions and provided its foundational collections and objects. Even still, there is a common misperception of what nonprofit tax-exempt status means, particularly as it pertains to remaining neutral. It is consistently held by trustees and staff alike that there are limits on what kind of opinions institutions might express in order to protect their tax-exempt status. In fact, there are only two things that by statute nonprofits may not do. And this you could find on the web on the IRS website. One, they may not campaign or lobby for or against an individual candidate for office. And two, they may not campaign for or against a particular piece of legislation. That's it. Over the last several years, protests have erupted regularly around how museums are funded, how they're organized, what they show, and how, who holds power within their structures, and how they reflect or fail to reflect a whole diversity of identities. In this book, I examine examples of these protests or calls for accountability in order to delve into both the histories of museums and cultural institutions in the United States and the useful lessons that might emerge. These constitute fascinating and revealing entry points to the manifestation of coloniality, white supremacy, class bias, and innumerable other social dimensions that persist and are contested today. As publics increase their demands for greater agency, inclusion, and diversity, cultural spaces must examine their own ways of being in order to remain relevant. I believe that to address the inequities that continue to haunt our institutions, and indeed society, we could not find a better place to begin than by dismantling the myth of neutrality in our cultural spaces. You might be thinking that everyone knows there's no such thing as a neutral space. However, the idea of neutrality manifests within cultural organizations in surprising ways. Consider this. With a membership of over 40,000 people and organizations, the International Council of Museums, or ICOM, bears considerable weight in its area of expertise. Founded in 1946, for nearly 50 years, the organization has defined museum as a nonprofit institution that, quote, acquires, conserves, researches, communicates, and exhibits the tangible and intangible heritage of humanity and its environment for the purposes of education, study, and enjoyment. Recently, however, relatively recently, this was written a while ago, a group of ICOM members decided to revisit this definition, and some felt it was out of date. A group proposed new language that describes museums as democratizing, inclusive, and polyphonic spaces for critical dialogue about the pasts and the futures that safeguard memories for future generations and guarantee equal rights and equal access to heritage for all people. The proposed language goes on to say that museums aim to contribute to human dignity and social justice, global equality, and planetary well-being. In mid-August 2019, backlash against this new proposal culminated with its dismissal as ideological by more than 24 of ICOM's country branches, including France, Italy, Spain, and Russia. While disputes over the definitions of long-standing institutions are not rare, in this case, it is noteworthy that the branches frame their objections in terms of the ideology that the new language signaled, the implication being that the previous definition was not ideological, and by extension, that the activities of the museum proceed from a neutral space. The question of whether museums are neutral, then, is at the crux of a contemporary conundrum about how stories have been told, who has told them, why and how they have been framed and historicized, and what it means that the foundational stories are being challenged today by a whole diversity of perspectives. The people who hold these diverse perspectives, it must be noted, have often been marginalized from society for their race, gender identity, class, educational levels, ability, and many other identity markers over many decades. Since museums are the West's modes of preserving history, we must ask, has the museum ever really been a neutral space? Has it not always had an agenda in its formulation? Is this necessarily always a bad thing, especially if those agendas include things like human dignity and planetary well-being, which are clearly positive aims, I think, anyway. There seems to be widespread discomfort about these ideas, as well as fear that cultural institutions and museums will somehow be reduced if their founding biases are made visible. It is my contention that these biases exist throughout human culture and that we must, at a minimum, see them and confront them, see them and confront the intended and unintended consequences of this very human condition. At a moment in human history when we must contemplate our own potential extinction due to extreme climate conditions we have brought about, and when nationalism has risen and xenophobia internationally has reared its head yet again in increasingly virulent and violent ways, how does culture respond? And how do museums remain relevant and effective in such times, especially when various publics and foundations are calling on museums to be publicly accountable for the ways in which they make decisions and for the ways they work? It is in this context and in this urgent moment that I believe we must be able to identify the biases of our museums, to understand the worldviews they both promote and marginalize, and to interrogate these ways of being, working, organizing, and making culture. I approach this project with a great deal of love for museums, especially the ones that I address specifically. They are struggling to change and reflect our highest social ideals, just as they confront their own blind spots and failures. We must identify why and how we are failing and fully embrace these failures as a starting point for reimagining the museum. But that's just the beginning. Art workers of all stripes are dedicated to shifting the practices of our institutions, and I hope to give their hard work the credit it deserves. They, more than anyone, know how much has been accomplished, and yet how much further our museums and cultural institutions must go to create truly accessible, participatory cultural commons. This book not only offers analyses of the sometimes obscured problematics of museums, but also points towards some ways they can be better for more people. Questions I approach through speculative thought include how we might act collectively to achieve these important transformations in the cultural field. Via these two sides of the same coin, I hope that with some care and patience, as well as some fortitude, we might look deeply at what and could shift, and then imagine how. So that's the introduction. And I guess before we get to the Q&A, I just want to offer just a couple of broad strokes thoughts about my learnings from this exercise of writing this book, which are essentially come in 4 points. The first one is that institutionally, we must slow down. The rate of cultural production is just too fast. Part of the reason mistakes get made is because of the speed with which cultural spaces move, and they do not have time to engage the proper stakeholders, nor do they have time to truly think it through. And I think that if there's going to be a true commitment to so-called DEAI work, slowing down is imperative. Because we have to be more intentionally planning the kinds of programs and initiatives that cultural institutions are engaging in. The other piece of the puzzle is this question about the way that cultural spaces tend to broadcast information rather than provide spaces for exchange. And this is about kind of privileging the knowledge that the institution holds over those knowledges that audiences and publics might hold. And I think that there needs to be a recalibration of that, and that museums and cultural sites clearly hold certain knowledges, but they don't hold others, and that those exchanges can fully blossom between the two entities, between publics and institutions. I also feel very strongly that unionization efforts and protest, and from an institutional perspective, as a former museum director, as somebody who has worked my entire career within cultural spaces, we often feel attacked by protests, by people who bring forceful critique. And I think there has to be a fundamental shift in the way that institutions receive critique and protest. And so efforts towards unionization and protest really need to be seen for what they are, which is a group of very invested people's radical care for the institution. There is something that is attempting to be communicated through protest, through unionization efforts and other strong critiques that as cultural spaces, we need to be more open to hearing and understanding. And the fourth thing is that as a particularly ripe space for fundamental change is the very sexy zone of human resources. I think there are some very simple and some extremely complex shifts that if we re-examine the way the operations of human resources functions within our institutions, there are great leaps that can be made within that. And those are just sort of 4 zones that I offer as places where maybe we can discuss further as we get into the Q&A. So I welcome your questions.
Thanks, Laura. That was great. There's already some questions starting to arrive in the chat. Then I'll read those out to you, and you can respond to them. Before I do that, I just want to take my role as moderator and the privilege of asking the first question myself. And just one of the things I really enjoyed about your book was how concrete it is in terms of the situations you described. And I was wondering if there was either one particular example of, for example, with the way that institutions and publics relate to each other, if there's a particular example you could think of that was either instructive in a positive sense, or one that you feel like is something that really teaches us some lessons about what to avoid? Because I think a lot of us are as well as myself, really interested in how we can do better as institutions in the ways that you were talking about just now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the example of the Sam Durant sculpture that was exhibited at the Walker Art Center called Scaffold, and its inclusion in the sculpture garden there, and the protests that emerged around that work is particularly instructive on a couple of different levels. So firstly, I'll address the controversy because that was kind of the most pressing piece. And this work was a sculpture that was made to echo the physical forms of several different state-sponsored gallows that were enacted throughout US history. The largest of these was a gallows that was constructed to murder a group of 38 Dakota men in the 19th century. And this is part of a painful part of Indigenous history, particularly in Minnesota, which is, and particularly as the Walker Art Center itself is located on unceded Dakota land. And so that's sort of the nut of, and so when this sculpture was installed, it wasn't even open to the public before there were, really significant protests about the work. In part, I think, because number one, well, for many reasons, but there was a lot of discussion about how could a white artist make this work without considering the feelings of of the indigenous peoples of this particular piece of geography. And, I think there are many different layers to the problematics of how the museum came to exhibit this work. And one was that, where the art world functions sometimes is quite separate from where, like, the publicness of a museum might function. And so this work was originally exhibited, that Sam Durant was commissioned to make it, and he exhibited it at Documenta, and it was seen there, and then the museum acquired it subsequently. So it wasn't as though it was commissioned for this particular space. And having talked to Sam, I do think that he would have had a very different interaction with the physical space had he been commissioned to do it for that site. But he wasn't, and it was, an acquisition. It functioned in a different part of, like, even an artist register about where the work was going to go eventually. And so, I think there wasn't enough thought put into on the part of the institution, particularly about how this work might be received, specifically because of its content in their context. And because the sculpture park is on unceded land, it created yet another layer. So this speaks to a couple of things. One is, how did the institution react? And I'll talk about that first, because I think that's really instructive. So one of the things that drives me bananas when controversies break out is when the museum puts down the kind of like PR wall of silence. It's just like the cone of silence. Nobody's allowed to say anything. It's like extremely, you get these statements that say nothing, that mean nothing, etc. And I think what the Walker did was really actually a very beautiful thing, which is that they apologized. They apologized for doing it wrong. And it was a very clear apology that the director of the museum made. It was a specific apology. It was a heartfelt apology. The artist, Sam Durant, also made a very specific and particular apology. And then he went beyond that, and he gifted the rights to the work to the Dakota people for them to determine what should happen to the sculpture. They determined that it should be burned, and so it was. This was a good outcome, in my view, not the burning of the sculpture necessarily, but to provide that agency following the re-traumatization of people based on the actions of the museum was, to me, a correct course of action, because they should have had people in the room to have the discussion about what this work might have meant in advance of the thing. But once the problem emerged, they had to be open to a radical way of engaging with the people who were protesting. And I thought that this solution may not have been the most elegant thing in the world, but it did actually actively hear and address the Dakota people who were saying this action of the museum has perpetrated a harm, a grave harm, and we need you to contend with that. The fact that there wasn't a more, imbricated relationship with, indigenous communities within Minnesota and all of that, that is a discussion for the structural piece. But as a response to a situation, I thought that was much better than, for example, the Whitney's kind of like cone of silence after the Dana Schutz painting came up, and then where they were just like, oh, we just have to defend the rights of the artist, like freedom of expression. That's like such a knee-jerk response. And it didn't actually get into the complexity of what was happening inside the museum and the conflicts that were emerging between different art workers that were even within the space of the museum about that work. So it kind of flattened something that I thought could deserve much more dimensionality. So I think for me, that's one example of like taking a really terrible situation because you have structural issues that have not enabled you to do the thing in the proper way, but confronting that problem with a level of integrity figuring out a way to move forward in a way that it actually addressed, perhaps satisfactorily, perhaps unsatisfactorily to some, satisfactory to others, but actually addressed this harm that was caused.
Thanks. That was something you talked about in the book too. That's really, I thought the way you discussed that was really helpful, and just the notion that I think is probably foreign to a lot of people who live their entire life in an institution, that you can actually, that you can respond to criticism and acknowledge that criticism without damaging the institution, but on the contrary, you can actually,
strengthen it.
Strengthen.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of questions piling up here. There are several questions about structural issues that you mentioned toward the end. Several people are interested in hearing more about slowing down, which is something I can understand. There's one question at the beginning that kind of speaks to what I think we were talking about just beforehand, and it's a question that is one I have as well, or just basically the question of what does it mean for a museum to collect and hold material. And the question is from Jay Mendez. Why do so many museums hoard the holdings not on display? Should they not share them with smaller museums?
Well, I have very specific views on collections, and I believe in collection sharing completely. It's hard when museums, obviously they can't be so physically. Many of them have many more works in their collections, than they could possibly ever show. I am a big fan of the idea of using, for example, public libraries to kind of rotate collections, that are held in private hands, that are held by institutions, to use systems like public libraries to show work more locally that may be important and locally relevant. And this is not a new idea. There were protest groups in the 60s that demanded that the Met, for example, show works from its collections, throughout the 5 boroughs. This has always been a question of the security of the works and all of that. But, I don't, I think there are ways of doing this. Not every single work in the collection of a museum is extremely delicate or requiring some kind of precious way of exhibiting it, or climate conditions or humidity levels, etc. There are ways that these collections can be circulated. through other institutions such as libraries, such as local museums, and community centers. And I think that that is just a desire to not engage with this idea. I also think that collections, to be honest with you, I've never worked in a museum that had a major collection. The Queen's Museum's collection is very idiosyncratic and not, it's not, like MoMA's collection. There's a lot of stuff from the 39 and 64 World's Fairs. There's like really interesting Cuban painting. It's a little bit all over the place. But, I do think that there is a certain logic to collecting for a lot of specific institutions that make sense for them. And so like for the Queen's Museum, given the history of the institution, collecting, for example, a lot of, this material from the World's Fair is so much part of its founding principles that it totally makes sense to be a repository for that. So.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question from Ellen Moore, who writes, I recall learning that many, if not most, US museums were founded by artists in the 18th and 19th century. They were later taken over by patrons, i.e. consumers, not producers of art. This is in contrast to the historical past of European institutions deriving from state patronage. Is an artist-controlled museum possible today? One that would foreground what artists, not collectors and politicians, considered important?
Oh, Ellen, good to hear from you. And yeah, I wish it were so. So interestingly, in my research, most of the US museums, the early ones, came out of groups of like the earliest museum public libraries, oh my God, I'm totally blanking what it's called now. It's in now North Carolina. Anyway, this library society, there's a Charlotte, I think it's the Charlottesville Library Society. In any case, I apologize. My brain just totally crapped out on me. But that was founded by a group of random dudes who like collected some stuff and some books and decided eventually that it should be made public. Now, what they consider public was very specific. It was still men and still men of a certain race and class. But they were certainly not producers of art or culture. They were definitely patrons. And, many museum collections that are affiliated with universities were actually begun by by alumni who then, whose kids like didn't care about their collections and they didn't know what to do with them, so they donated them to their alumni, to their alma mater, thinking, well, at least somebody will get some use of it. And then these become studied. But at the end of the day, these become studied, they become reified, they become enshrined within the institution as part of legacy. And the reality is that those collections started off as very personal things. It's not collectors buy the things they like, the things that they are attracted to, the things that they're even exposed to. So whether these are very classed, raced questions of taste that have been part of the museum from the very beginning, from the collecting institution from the very beginning. And so I think that in terms of collections, we need to ask those questions about what does it mean beyond even the questions of like colonial power and the acquisition and stealing of objects from less powerful peoples, but also the simple fact that these collections came from a very specific place because they were collected by very specific people. And those realities have to just be said out loud. It can't just be like, this is the collection that is always excellent and amazing just because it's here in X institution, but rather we appreciate this work that was collected by this very specific individual, X. So, I think that there's some subtlety in there, and that's an important piece of my thinking. Of course, there are certain artists who I think would control institutions in exactly the same way that the patrons control them. So, I'm not sure that that artists them, in and of themselves are solutions. I think that we have to create a greater like civic importance to culture, especially here in the United States. In Europe, it has a slightly different sensibility, in part because, as you say, Alan, um, European institutions derive from state patronage. Well, of course, before the state patronage happens, they were, from royalty and the church, largely those collections. So those two come from very specific sites and positionalities.
So we have a few minutes left, and I'm just scrolling through here to see if I can somehow try to combine some of these questions maybe. There are two questions about the slowing down. One of them pointing out that, museums kind of have most people have the impression of museums as places where nothing moves and it doesn't change at all. And yet people who work within them know that they're really, going at a breakneck speed, and there's no time to slow down. So, and the other question really, so could you talk about that tension? But basically both questions are also, how would this be done? How can we as cultural producers take stock, resist, take a stand on really thinking, slowing down and considering how we work, why we work, and who we work for? I mean, so those are two questions kind of I combined.
Yeah, so slowing down to me is very important. I know that many people feel like museums are slow places, and that's good that they feel that way to publics, I think, because it means that you can return and kind of absorb. And I feel like I'm always missing exhibitions, so I feel like it's always too fast. But then I worked at DF for 10 years where we only changed stuff very infrequently. So, it was more about how I always thought about, like the permanent installations of Walter de Maria's works in Soho as being places where nothing changes except us, and we kind of the artwork becomes a barometer of how we change as visitors. But anyway, that's a sort of side view. But slowing to the point of slowing down, I think the diversity of cultural production, the way cultural institutions has to be dealt with, and I think there's something really different. A lot of people ask me, like, why don't we just blow up these places? Like, this is just shitty. Like, it's never going to get better. Like, let's just get rid of them. Let's start over, burn it down. And I guess, my response to that is like, okay, is the Met going to suddenly, turn itself inside out and like completely remake itself? No, that's obviously not going to happen. I'm a pretty practical gal. Like, that's definitely not going to happen. But I can see already through much smaller institutions that are doing incredible work, like Recess in Brooklyn, which is paying everybody a minimum wage of $65,000 a year. Mind blowing. Everyone who works there as a starting point towards as a clear and decisive move towards equity. There's another Brooklyn-based cultural institution called the Laundromat Project. Admire them hugely. They did an open call for board members. They got 5 new board members through an open call. Okay, so these ways of thinking, you can't come up with a new process like finding board members through an open call without slowing yourself down. There's no way that you can produce at the level that most cultural spaces and organizations produce. There's no way to kind of rethink your systems when you're in it. So you've got to create that space, which is the same, which is definitely the same for kind of confronting, racial inequity within a museum. You can't be expected to do that on top of everything else that you're scrambling to do every day. You have to actually stop doing some other stuff so that you can make the space and the time and to provide the thinking time and the action time that these things really deserve. So whenever people say, like, we have a new DEAI initiative, I always ask, well, what are you not doing to make space for that? Because you can't do everything. And so to me, the slowing down is deeply related to the questions of equity, because it doesn't mean slowing down on the front of like making things more equitable. It means slowing down so that you do less to make space to actually support that work, because you cannot just keep piling it on. And that's what institutions do. They're just like, oh, we set up a task force. Oh, there's some committee. Oh, there's some working group. No, it doesn't work like that. You got to take stuff away. And so, to me, a challenge to my staff at one point at the Queen's Museum during one of our, annual strategic, planning meetings was, okay, I want you, everybody has to cancel a program, not because you're not going to replace it, but because I want you to spend more time thinking about how you're doing your work.
Well,
Nobody wanted to cancel anything.
That's just it. I mean, I was just going to say, I was just telling my boss yesterday, because we were having another conversation of that kind, about, what aren't you going to do? And I said, if I had a dime for every time I was in a meeting where that was the topic, I could retire now. I mean, it's nothing ever does get dropped, and we just get more and more things added. So the idea of forcing people to drop something is maybe an interesting idea. Again, we've run over, unfortunately, already, and I need to keep us on time here. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to play my accustomed role as the person who shuts down the wet blanket at the beach. But before I do that, Laura, I just want to thank you once again, and a lot of people in the chat and also in the Q&A are very, very appreciative and just clapping silently their hands for your sharing your time with us. Many people have asked questions that I know that if they want to read the book, they'll hear more about what you have to say about a lot of those things. So I'd like to encourage people to do that. Certainly, it was it gave me a lot of ideas about how I might do things better. So with that, let me just say to everyone who's out there that this session was recorded and it will be available on YouTube, on the Beinecke's YouTube channel. I will send out an email to everyone who's registered for this call, as well as to all the people who are on the Art and Protest mailing list. If you're not on the mailing list but would like to know about future events, just write to me, kevin.rep@yale.edu, and I'll be happy to keep you informed about things that are coming up in the future. And we do have some exciting things. So with that, thank you again, and everyone, Laura, everyone have a good evening, and think about our friends who need our help today around the world. Thank you.